Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast. My name is Joe Cocozza, and I'm the Director of the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice at Research Associates, based in upstate New York, and I want to welcome all of you to this webinar on improving outcomes for court-involved youth with co-occurring disorders. Before we begin with the substance of this webinar, I've asked Tom Templeton, who's been responsible for coordinating this effort, to give us a little bit of information about the webinar. Tom?
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. So just a little bit of information before we get started. As you can see, the recording of this webinar, along with the PowerPoint slides you'll see soon, will be available at NCMHJJ.com. If during the webinar you experience any technical issues, please use the chat feature to ask for help. And the format of today's webinar will include 3 presentations. A follow-up Ask the Expert series will be held to allow sufficient time for questions and discussion. And an e-blast with registration information for the Ask the Expert sessions is forthcoming to all webinar participants. This is the Ask the Expert schedule. These are also our presenters for the day. So as you can see, Wednesday, November 12th at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Robert Kinscherff will be speaking. Friday, December 5th at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, Holly Hills. And Wednesday, December 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern Daylight, Richard Shepler will be speaking. All right. Question? Yep. So we're actually going to do, in the spirit of interactivity and information gathering, we're going to be asking a few poll questions during the webinar, and we can start with the first one right now. The first question, are you directly involved in the operation of a juvenile drug treatment court? We really appreciate your responses. Take another minute. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Tom. Once again, this webinar is focused on improving outcomes for court-involved youth with co-occurring disorders. And it is being sponsored by the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, along with the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, and much of the work that will be presented today is a result of a grant to the National Council on Juvenile Family Court Judges from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. This webinar has several objectives that we hope to accomplish over the next 60 to 90 minutes. The first is to discuss throughout all the presentations the need for addressing court-involved youth with co-occurring disorders. Secondly, to suggest some new directions for improving policies and procedures. Thirdly, for describing some of the new models that exist with regard to treatment, particularly around integrating substance abuse and mental health services. And then lastly, to offer some concrete examples of model court programs that exist in different places in the country that have demonstrated success. I think probably everyone who is on this webinar is aware of the reasons why we should focus on youth with co-occurring disorders. First of all, as I think we're beginning to realize through a lot of the recent research, many of the youth who come before drug courts, who become involved in the juvenile justice system, experience both mental health and substance use issues, which are usually referred to as co-occurring disorders. At least one study done nationally in a number of sites found that of 60% of the youth with mental health disorders also experience co-occurring substance use issues. Secondly, it's not only the high number, but also the fact that this has a very significant impact on the youth and their outcomes, so that we know that in areas such as relapse, outcomes such as schools, recidivism rates, all tend to be much poorer for youth who have co-occurring disorders than youth with only mental health or substance use issues. Thirdly, the presence of youth with co-occurring disorders and the recognition of their large numbers is placing challenges on juvenile drug treatment programs, which historically have focused primarily on responding to youth with addiction problems rather than youth having both mental health and substance use issues. And then thirdly, as a result of all of that, clearly I think there's a growing recognition that we need to rethink, adjust, adapt, modify, but in some way change the policy and practice and treatment in order to successfully address the needs of these youth coming in contact with the courts and the justice system with co-occurring disorders. Because of those kinds of issues, we joined with the National Council on Juvenile Family Court Judges to produce a series of briefings, and these are available through our website at NCMHJJ, and the titles and the authors are there up on the website. We released these a few months ago in conjunction, again, with the National Council to try to respond and provide some guidance to the field around how to better address the needs of these youth with co-occurring disorders. The presenters today who will be addressing primarily those topics listed in the briefings, Robyn Kinscherff. Robyn is someone who works with us here as the Senior Associate for the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, and also works as a Vice President at Massachusetts School of Professional Psychology in Boston. Secondly, we will hear from Richard Shepler, who is at the Begun Center for Violence Prevention Research at Case Western University in Cleveland, Ohio. And thirdly, we have Holly Hills, who is the Associate Professor at the Department of Mental Health, Law, and Policy at the University of South Florida. What we've asked each of them to do is to do a presentation for approximately 20 minutes or so. Once again, as Tom indicated earlier, rather than allowing 5 or 10 minutes for questions, what we will be doing is following up with an Ask the Experts opportunity for people who are on the webinar to join in and to, in fact, ask questions and have a discussion not only with the presenters but other people in the field. If you, in fact, you have some questions as you hear the presenters and you want to make sure that we address those in the Ask the Expert sessions, please put those in on your chat line and we'll make sure that we look at those and summarize those and begin the Ask the Expert series with them. So with that, I'd like to ask Robyn Kinscherff to begin doing the presentation on developing effective policies for addressing the needs of youth with co-occurring disorders. Robyn?
Thank you, Joe, and also thank you, Tom. Welcome to all of you who are participating in this webinar, and I hope that many of you will also participate in the follow-up Ask the Experts webinars. I'm going to be talking a bit today about the development or the adaptation of currently existing policies or new policies for effectively addressing the needs of youth with co-occurring disorders. As Joe pointed out, the research increasingly shows a very high level of co-occurring disorder amongst youth who are before the juvenile court. And for those who do not have those needs met, their outcomes are certainly worse than we would hope, which is why this initiative, I think, is a very important one. With this recognition comes the need to stay consistent with the 16 strategies which have guided the development of drug courts, but also to develop local capacities for integrated care from the point of identification of the co-occurring disorders amongst court-involved youth through their effective intervention in treatment programming. There are several key decisions that need to be made in thinking about policies and practices intended to more adequately focus upon co-occurring disordered youth. One simple one is, but fundamental one, is establishing the eligibility and exclusion criteria for the co-occurring court or the juvenile drug court with a co-occurring capacity. This really is a fundamental strategic decision that you will make about the bandwidth, if you will, of who you think you can target your resources to serve for co-occurring youth. Many drug courts have traditionally excluded from their population served those youth with significantly impairing mental health disorders. And it's important to think in a very hard-nosed and realistic way about the range of youth that you can serve, both in terms of their impairments arising from addiction, but also their impairments arising from a treatable mental illness. And what we have learned is we have probably excluded more youth than was wise, and certainly we can include more youth than we have in the past in a co-occurring disorders court. This will also mean modifications in screening and assessment. It will require an expansion of screening to try and capture those youth who have mental health disorders and pairing them up with those screening tools that you may already have in place addressing the substance use disorders. And it will also require the development and assessment capacity that brings these two together. We've also learned that a key ingredient in successful courts, drug courts in general, but certainly those with the capacities to serve co-occurring disordered youth, is more effective youth and family involvement, from the individual case to involving input by parents and youth with lived experience with co-occurring disorders in the evolution of policies and practices. We'll also want to think carefully about how to develop integrated treatment services, and Dr. Shepler will speak specifically about that in the course of his comments today. We've also learned that careful attention needs to be given to the ways in which we structure or restructure violations and the processes of sanctions and rewards, and think carefully about modifications to graduation expectations. This slide reminds us that we need to be thinking about including youth with mental health disorders. It's probably more important to think about criteria that focus upon the degree of the functional impairment of the youth rather than a specific diagnosis or diagnostic category. For example, there will be some youth who may have very severely impairing depression that may require more immediate psychiatric response and might be excluded on the basis of their functional impairment, and some youth who are developing a psychotic disorder, but which at the point of contact with the juvenile justice system may be something that can be fairly readily managed with the right psychiatric intervention as part of an integrated treatment plan. Screening and assessment will require both of the tools integrated into consistent protocols and, of course, empirically validated for the purposes for which they're screening. The youth who screen positive should be then sent on to individualized assessments. You will need to develop capacity, if you don't already have such a capacity, for clinicians doing the assessments who are trained in co-occurring disorder assessment methods. Traditionally, people have been trained either in the substance abuse world or in the mental health world, and here you're really looking to take skilled individuals and to make them capable of this integrated assessment model. Because of the high prevalence of youth who have faced multiple adversities in their development, we also want to be able to consistently build in the trauma-informed dimension of assessment so that we can yield individualized case-specific plans that allow for treatment matching in an effective integrated treatment model. We know we get better outcomes with higher levels of family engagement, and you may wish to consider requiring family participation in screening, assessment, and treatment by at least one family member, although I think we often need to think broadly about what constitutes a family or who might be an eligible family member for meeting this requirement for family participation. It may not necessarily be a parent. It may be an aunt, an uncle, a cousin, somebody who can be a positive participant with the youth during the course of involvement in the juvenile drug court. Here you see a list of various family-friendly practices which have been developed in different courts. We certainly appreciate that local circumstances may more readily facilitate some of these options and may make it more difficult to do others, but certainly taking steps with such things as considering when to schedule sessions so that you maximize the likelihood that working parents who do want to be involved can effectively attend. Certainly want to think about recognizing broadly the family constellation to identify people in the family who support the recovery of the youth. Some courts have recruited parents who have had their own experiences with addiction or raising children who have their own co-occurring difficulties as supports, as peer supports, and involving folks like this to participate as team members in your own juvenile drug court. We've also learned that we get better outcomes with integrated evidence-based practices that focus treatment on the co-occurring disorders simultaneously. Dr. Shepler will speak about this as well. I think the main point that I would want to emphasize that you may have to work very hard to avoid settling for what is available. Sometimes people will comfort themselves with the thought that something is better than nothing, but in fact the rates of treatment failure amongst co-occurring disordered youth when they don't get an adequately integrated evidence-based treatment plan are such that it really is not the case that something is better than nothing. And in fact, enrolling them in treatments and interventions which are unlikely to be successful is at least an opportunity cost and may actually serve over time to make things worse as they fail out of your program and continue to penetrate into the juvenile justice system. It's important to work with community-based clinical services providers in order to develop that capacity. And again, Dr. Shepler and Dr. Hills will be talking about some of the dimensions of this process. I certainly would encourage you, wherever possible, to bring insurers or other funders into the conversation, since these kinds of programs may not fit on a ready menu that insurers and other funders may already have. Just as substance use recovery is characterized by relapse along the way to recovery, mental health disorders may also have a waxing and waning course of symptoms despite participation in treatment, and this is especially the case in early phases of treatment. So there may be times when a youth is doing everything that is reasonably possible to effectively engage in treatment, and they may not yet have had a successful remission of symptoms or a substantial improvement in their functioning, so that violations and sanctions for at least those difficulties arising from a mental health disorder should focus on treatment engagement and not solely on fluctuations of symptoms, and where the difficult behaviors are tightly linked to the symptoms of mental health disorder, not solely on the presence or absence of particular behaviors. For example, a youth who is significantly depressed and marked uncharacteristic irritability is part of their symptom picture, we may need to work with the depression for some time before you see the remission of outbursts associated with their still inadequately treated depression. So violation, sanctions, and rewards should consider treatment attendance and participation. I think it is important to distinguish between attendance and participation because there are certainly some youth who will attend but will not effectively engage, and you really want to track effective engagement. You also want to track the degree of progress as it interacts with the in substance use recovery as it tracks with their recovery from their mental health disorder and looking at their functioning across a number of familiar domains. Graduation expectations. We ordinarily want to hold youth with co-occurring disorder to the same criteria as those with just a mental health disorder or just a substance use disorder, but it's important to consider, as we were mentioning before, whether failure to achieve some of the expectations really is reflecting the functional impact of active and still yet unresolved mental disorder that is beyond the ready control of the youth. This will require that people carefully consider evidence for the linkage between the mental health disorder and the target behavior. You want to focus upon the ultimate markers of success in co-occurring treatment, which include things like the degree of their active participation in treatment, the evidence of substance use recovery over time, increased functional capacities, reduced impairment across domains, and of course, reduced rearrests or violations of the expectations of the court. The emerging models for court-involved youth with co-occurring disorders they're still underway. There is a lot of variation in the research about outcomes, but it's also true that there's still a lot of variation in the way that people practice in juvenile drug courts or have taken steps to integrate co-occurring disorders into their practices and their policies. So we're at a stage in the development where it is promising but still underway. We know that key modifications are required in the sorts of policies and practices that we've been discussing during this portion of the webinar, and that no matter how good your drug court may be in identifying and screening these youth, you are really well advised to make sure that a well-running juvenile drug court is referring to interventions that are evidence-based and integrated co-occurring disorder treatments. So I'll turn the webinar over to Dr. Shepler.
Robyn, before you do, I just would ask Tom if he could give us a sense of how people answered the first question and give them a second question.
Absolutely. Thanks again, Robert. That was terrific. So what we're looking at now is just for those of you who are just on the phone and can't see the video, just if you were interested, the response to the first question, are you directly involved in the operation of a juvenile drug treatment court? About a third of participants who answered are directly involved with a juvenile drug treatment court. And now moving on to the next question. Which of the following most closely describes your role? A, judge, B, court staff, C, attorney, D, probation officer, E, service provider, or F, other. We'll give you a minute to answer that question for us. Thanks again.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, everyone, for responding to our poll and the question we have. And Robert, thank you very much for an excellent presentation and a very nice overview about the whole variety of issues that need to be addressed. As you ended your piece, Robert, you raised the issue about integrated treatment for youth with co-occurring disorders. And I think one of the issues that comes up frequently in the work that we do is what does that mean and what does it look like? And so to help us with that, we have our next presenter, Richard Shepler, to provide us with an overview on what it means to provide effective integrated treatment. Richard?
Thank you, Joe. I'll spend the next approximately 20 minutes talking about kind of what we've learned about effective treatment for youth with co-occurring disorders. You know, the first thing that we know, when I first started as a professional back in the day, we did things mostly around sequential or serial treatment, and if we had a referral for mental health, we'd say, well, when you're done with your substance abuse treatment, you can come back and see us. So it was a sequential kind of a treatment. We really believe that symptoms of one disorder can't be resolved until the symptoms of another disorder are addressed. We're doing a whole lot less of that now, and that's good. We moved on to parallel treatment, both services provided at the same time by different professionals in different systems or agencies, but with different treatment plans. And the problem with parallel treatment, while still good that the youth is getting both types of treatment at the same time, is that sometimes the treatment plans may not be going in the same direction, and the youth and or family may hear different ideas about what will help them get better. And it's also an increasing burden. It also increases the burden to the youth and family to receive, you know, more than one service. One of the trends that I'm seeing in general in many of our communities is that we have actually more services that we're offering youth, and the family feels burdened by the amount of services they're getting. So not necessarily more is better. We've trended toward, and we're going towards integrated treatment, where both mental health and substance abuse treatment is provided by one provider, one assessment, and one treatment plan. And we believe youth and families are best served when there is an integrated screening, assessment, and treatment plan for that youth. When looking for integrated programs, we really haven't stayed up on that as treatment providers. We're just getting to what does integrated look like, and we're getting much better at creating some of these programs. So if you're a jurist and you're looking for what kind of programs do I want to look for or order in your communities, certainly you want to look for something that is an integrated co-occurring program. We have the integrated co-occurring treatment program in about 9 sites nationwide. There's the Family Integrated Transitions Program, which is mostly in the state of Washington, the FIT program, which is another integrated co-occurring treatment program. And then we have services over time that have adapted their services and added a substance abuse component and or a mental health component. So, for example, a multidimensional family therapy originally designed to treat youth with substance abuse disorders now does a whole lot of treatment around trauma and mental health as well as substance abuse. Functional family therapy has an adaptation, a contingency management treatment adaptation now. So they have a substance abuse component to their model. And then multisystemic therapy, known to also to many of you, has a substance abuse adaptation as well. These models do well in, again, one treatment plan, one assessment, one set of services for the youth and family. So you can look for those kind of services in your community and see what's available. The reality is that the optimal effects require interventions that impact multiple areas of a kid's life, their symptom patterns, whether that's their behaviors, cognitions, emotions, factors including trauma, risk and safety issues, which I'll talk more about as we move on today because it's such a large issue. Family systems and recovery environments. We know the research is pretty clear that youth with co-occurring disorders do better when they have a family recovery environment, a sober living environment. We also know the research is pretty clear that if they're hanging with positive pro-social peers, they also do better. So we need programs that really target each of these areas and also school and community functioning, as well as positive development. It appears that our youth are the youth that get kicked out of school, if you will, or are in alternative school settings. Part of our job is, can we keep our kids in school, passing and attending? The next slide goes into a little bit more detail of the many issues that we look at in an integrated model. And you can see in this diagram the many factors that contribute to a symptom or a behavior or something that comes to your attention even in a courtroom, including developmental factors, including risk and resiliency factors. Certainly trauma factors play into this. Multiple contextual factors, whether it's home, school, peers, community, as well as the use substance abuse and mental health disorder as they present. You know, we wonder out loud, is co-occurring a sufficient term to describe all the things that are going on in a youth and a family's life? So we actually are, you know, kind of going toward using the word multiply occurring conditions. In research by Mike Dennis out of Chestnut, he found that typically youth with co-occurring conditions and substance abuse disorders have at least 5 or more problems on the GAIN measure that he uses to assess youth. So multiply occurring conditions probably is a better term. In 1999, we were asked to begin the development of a co-occurring treatment program for youth. At the time, we were really unaware of any other kind of integrated programs available for youth. And we convened a group of experts statewide here in Ohio to really think about what would that model look like, and then put the components together. So the integrated co-occurring treatment program is a promising practice that utilizes integrated treatment approach embedded in an intensive home-based service delivery model, and we'll talk about that in a second, to provide both mental health and substance abuse treatment to youth with co-occurring disorders. The services are provided in the home, school, and community where the youth live, with the goal of safely maintaining the youth in the least restrictive, most normative environment. The main purpose of the ICT model is placement, prevention, reunification, and stabilization around safety issues. When we go back to the previous slide when I listed the current integrated programs, the majority of integrated programs actually have chosen to deliver their services in the home and community environment, so they're mostly home-based programs. And the majority of those programs also have a strong family component, family systems component to them. So to help youth get to a better place, not only are we working with individual issues, but we really do need to work on family issues as well. Core assumptions in the ICT model and working with youth with co-occurring conditions. Youth with COD present with multiple and complex symptom patterns and behaviors which adversely affect their functioning and developmentally important life domains. So they're struggling in a lot of places with a lot of different things going on. Co-occurring presentation in youth is affected by brain development, so development matters, and conversely, brain development is impacted by substance use. Traumatic stress experiences contribute to impaired emotional and behavioral functioning and to the adoption of risk behaviors, which in turn may lead to further exposure to victimization, violence, and trauma experiences. You know, the ICT model we consider to be a frontline trauma service because one of the main things that we try to do is create safety in youth and families' lives. If we do our job well as practitioners in the field, we should be helping not only create safety, but helping managing the risk that the court is, you know, saying, hey, we need somebody to help us out there, not only to provide treatment, but really in a sense to help manage the risk and safety of the youth in the community. Safety concerns and risk behaviors are elevated for youth with co-occurring disorders and need to be intensively managed and monitored. So look for programs that are on call to their youth and families, basically 24/7. Many of the intensive home-based programs that were mentioned earlier are on call. Most of them are on call to their families 24/7, or at least 24/5 and rotate an on-call on the weekend. Contextual factors, including peers, family, school, neighborhood, and the risk and protective factors associated with them play a mediating role in youth behaviors, youth patterns, and recovery trajectory. So look for programs that address those components, peers, family, school, neighborhood. The stressors associated with co-occurring disorders negatively strain family, interpersonal, and material resources. It's also important to remember that when a family is raising a youth with co-occurring disorders, that puts an immense strain on their family dynamics. And as Robert said, that treatment engagement and readiness to change are more difficult to attain and sustain. So you're looking also for programs that really do persistent engagement and utilize motivational interviewing to work on readiness to change issues as well. The ICT model has, these 6 major components. This intensive home-based service delivery model, to shorthand that, basically means the services are provided intensively, 2 to 4 times sessions a week, multiple houred sessions. The provider's on call to the family, small caseloads, and brief periods of treatment, so 3 to 6 months. We find that outcomes in general for our youth, we see the best outcome actually in the first 3 months of treatment, and then from there probably in the next 3 months after that, there's another gain score that you'll see in these youth. But really in the first 3 to 6 months is when you're going to see the majority of movement. Another component, obviously, is that we provide culturally mindful services and partnerships with family. We find our best results when we partner with our families. The key aspect of the service is, a multidimensional integrated assessment where the youth gets this integrated assessment. And as Robert had mentioned earlier, matching the services, a comprehensive integrated treatment array matched to the needs and the strengths of the youth and the family. One of the things that we found when we've implemented the program is that we get a better result when we team effectively and intentionally with local court systems. And that can take on a lot of, that can look a lot of different ways. However, a regular meeting with local probation, intensive probation, or the courts to team, if you will, the treatment and the services and the court services seems to work best. So cross-system collaboration and service coordination is an essential component. Core services in ICT, crisis intervention stabilization. Again, our main goal is safety stabilization. We work with the youth on their substance abuse and mental health concerns that issues that they bring forward in an integrated way. We do a lot of skill building, psychoeducation with youth around their substance abuse and mental health concerns. As Robert mentioned earlier, motivational interviewing is a key treatment that it goes along with all of our co-occurring programs that we've talked about earlier. Family-focused systemic interventions, cross-system coordination and supports, and then asset and support building activities. One of the things we found over the years is that we think that 12-step programs can work if we get them into the right kind of a 12-step program, specifically led by other youth or for other youth. But those programs are sometimes hard to find. So we're leaning more toward finding recovery mentors, positive adults in a youth's life that can maintain a relationship post-treatment. So asset support building activities is a part of what we do with the model as well. Target outcomes that we're looking for is we're trying to keep kids in the community and the home safely, attending and achieving at school and work, obviously reduced involvement in the juvenile justice system, reduced use or no use of substances. Obviously, when we're working with the youth, we are telling them that, we're looking at abstinence. But in our treatment minds, we're thinking about, we want risk reduction. And I don't say substance abuse reduction, I'm talking about risk reduction. We don't want you involved in behaviors that cause risk to you. And hopefully that would also be with reduction in substances or no use. Participating in positive and family, peer and community life, improved family recovery environment, and accessing resources and natural supports. Some some of the take-home messages, having now implemented the service now for over 13 years, is to have realistic outcomes and expectations for the youth and families we're serving. Think trajectory of wellness over time. And I think Robert talked about the importance of adjusting sanctions to meet, the kids that we're working with. Mike Dennis has done a ton of research on, substance abuse in youth, and basically the research is pretty clear that substance use is an ongoing, a chronic relapsing disorder. So we have to be really careful on what our total expectation is for when we work with youth with co-occurring disorders. We often can get a reduction in substance abuse. We get a reduction in mental health symptomatology. We often get kids back in school. So we can do pretty well, but we're not necessarily going to reach a cure, if you will, for those youth. The other thing that we've learned over time is, measure what we do, risk reduction across life domains. If we only look at abstinence at the end of 30 days, many of these programs will look less than successful. So we need to measure multiple outcomes across multiple life domains of the youth that reflect what we're doing in the treatment. The other thing that we have learned, and I'll leave you, this will be my last piece here, is that because outcomes look different, it's really important to have conversation with key stakeholders about what's realistically, what can realistically be achieved in outcomes over time in these programs. And with that, I will turn it back over to Tom and Joe.
Thank you very much, Richard. Appreciate it. Tom is going to once again give us a sense of how you answered the last question and give you the third and final question that we'd ask you to respond to. Tom?
Thanks, Joe. The second question again was, which of the following most closely describes your role? And as it turns out, the most significant responses were both service providers and probation officers. But also, we found that the category other was also really well represented, and we genuinely appreciate the interest of those who do not have necessarily a direct operation in a juvenile drug treatment court. This is an important subject, and we thank you for being here. Our third question and final question of the day is, to what extent do you think the presence of youth with co-occurring disorders presents a challenge for juvenile drug treatment courts? A, significantly, B, somewhat, C, not at all, or D, I don't know. We'll take a minute with that.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thank all of you once again. The last presentation we have is by Holly Hills, and having listened to Robert and Richard so far, I think one of the questions that many people have is, can you realistically implement some of the guidelines and some of their suggestions for how to improve both the policies and procedures as well as treatment? And so what we've asked Holly to do in this last presentation is to give a couple of concrete examples of drug courts and program and treatment courts where they're in fact trying to move towards the kinds of things that we've heard the first two presenters suggest. So Holly?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So we'll go ahead and talk about the types of things to begin with that you're going to look at, and they've been alluded to in both the prior presentations. But certainly, if you're in a position to start to be thinking about modifying your program, as Joe said, you really want to think about, what the what the package of resources are that you have, and where your continuum of service is at this point in time. So if you're expanding your role to expanding your population to look at youth with more severe mental health disorders than perhaps you did in the past, you really want to evaluate your service continuum and determine where do we need to fill the gaps, what kind of needs do we have, and begin to think about who's able to offer you those evidence-based practices or promising practices that really integrate care that we've just been talking about. So as you are thinking about your community and your services, you'll have to include some planning for how to build that in or how to identify those resources and bring them into your group. Certainly as a process of this evolution from, perhaps looking at a single category of disorder, may potentially just substance use disorders in your population, to expanding to more mild, moderate, to even severe mental health disorders, you're going to look at what are there elements of your program policies and criteria that historically were framed around excluding those individuals out. That's not to say when you make your revision to these criteria that you will be able to take all comers, let's say, because certainly you're going to have to look at that service continuum that we're talking about and see what it affords you and what kind of service range is really offered in your community to know how far you can expand. So, and again, this may occur incrementally in your community. You may be able to expand somewhat and then over time develop the resources to address an even larger population. But we really, probably an essential part of going through this process of evolution and change is going to be looking at your policies and your criteria to see who you can expand toward and offering services to a broader audience. Another initial task will be, in all likelihood, modifying the content of your screening and assessment tools. If you were in the past just focused on identifying the severity or the presence of a substance use disorder or making that substance use disorder diagnosis, you may not have captured enough information in your previous screening and assessment methodologies to be able to say whether or not the youth that you're seeing have co-occurring mental health disorders. So one of the tasks will be to identify where in your referral and assessment continuum you want to add additional screening and assessment measures that will really help you identify the presence of the mental health disorders that you feel are within your scope to address, and that you have identified treatment resources in the community that are doing the evidence-based practices or developing them to be able to address that continuum of mental health problem. So we're going to look at those kinds of things as sort of the initial efforts that you're considering. And in the examples that I'm giving you today, both of the sites that I'll talk a little bit about have done those things, have gone through these processes, have identified changes in their service continuum, have altered their program policies and criteria, and have made some choices around their screening and assessment tools. So the two programs that we're going to discuss today, one is out of Summit County in Ohio, the Crossroads program, and the second one is Ouachita Parish, Louisiana, in the 4th Judicial District Juvenile Drug Treatment Court. Starting first to talk about the Summit County program. Approximately 70 youth annually move through this program. They're aged 12 to 17, and they are brought into the program post-adjudication. They can get their records expunged if they successfully complete the program. And this program was really one of the early adopters in terms of the identification of youth having more severe mental health disorder presentations, and in about 2002, a 40-member advisory board here began to look at and plan and implement the Crossroads program to really look at this expanded population. So they are interested and do take in youth with more severe forms of mental health disorders, and they have some exclusionary criteria, but they have a much broader kind of perspective on who they can take into their program. Over a course of approximately a year's time, they offer 4 phases of contact with the youth in the program, decreasing in intensity from weekly to monthly meetings across the period that they're involved. One of the innovative elements of this program is that youth receive a significant amount of services in their home and have a very intense experience with their counselor, with 3 to 5 hours of contact with their counselor per week. So that's a very low caseload kind of experience for them, and it gives them a lot of intense contact with the youth to see how they're doing and how they're managing in their movement through the phases of the program. Also, a unique element of this program is the training of the probation officers in motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. So they also have a significant amount of contact with the youth under their supervision, with 2 to 3 times per week meetings, utilizing these techniques that they've been trained in. As with the other presenters today, you know, part of the program is really looking at how to encourage engagement in these movement through these phases. Obviously, integrating the care for their mental health and their substance use disorders is important, but also encouraging them just to be retained in care is an essential component. So in this program particularly, they do a series of sanctions depending on the individual's movement through the program and difficulties that they're having. So these sanctions might include electronic monitoring. It could include their suspension of their driver's license or changes in their curfew. So these are common kinds of things that are considered in the programs. On the plus side, incentives for continued positive movement through the phases include access to field trips, availability of movie and sports tickets to reinforce their positive performance in the program, and gift cards. So as they move through, they're going to hopefully make it through the phases and ultimately apply as they go along to be moved and finally apply to be released in letter form from their probation when they've met all the criteria. Here we go. Next, we'll talk a little bit about Ouachita Parish, Louisiana. In this program, you see a little broader range of age. Youth as young as 10 have been taken into this program, and they get an initial clinical eligibility screening to determine where they're at and if they're appropriate for the program. The youth with co-occurring disorders are typically participating for about a 9-month program, and they are moving through one of 2 treatment tracks that are offered. One of the elements here as well in this program is they have implemented is the utilization of structured screening and assessment measures, both in the initial phases of referral. So the MACI-2 is used by some of their referrers to identify youth that may be appropriate to come into the program. And then as they move through the program, additional measures are administered, both to look at their motivation for the program and their continued interest and their eagerness for treatment. So a series of structured measures are used to evaluate their movement through the program. Similar to the previous program, they have significant amounts of time and contact with their case managers. So in the initial phases, they will see case managers 2 times per week and also meet with their probation officer in the initial phase 2 times weekly to begin. Over the course of the 9-month term, or, you know, again, individualized for the individual's performance and how they're doing, they will evolve to 2 times a month across the course of the term of the program. As I mentioned, the program is divided into 2 program tracks, and most of the youth who have been identified with mental health disorders are moving through a 4-phase track, which is called Track 2, and it has an additional aftercare phase. And so this gives them some ability to really tailor it to the individual, how they're moving through the program, and make sure that all of the experiences are in place that they've had, that they're achieving them, and able to maintain it. So there's that kind of individualized notion to it for youth with the co-occurring disorders, which is, I think, one of the essential components of this. Some of the elements of this program that they've implemented over the last almost 10 years now are the application of promising and evidence-based practices. The cannabis youth treatment is offered to them as a group intervention, and it offers elements of problem solving, anger management, helping them improve their communication skills, coping with craving and urges to use, managing symptoms of depression, helping them think about high-risk situations that they might find themselves in, and coping with and preventing relapse. So in that, that's one of the elements of the offerings. Solution-focused brief therapy is also delivered to the individuals in the program, and it really is importantly chosen because its strength, focused, and it really helps the individual look at their treatment goals, helps them understand strategies that they can apply that were effective, ones that they've used in the past and ones that they could use in the future, focuses on their ability to change and their capacity to create their own solutions to problems. So the theme of problem solving and improved problem solving is one that we see come up a lot. Access to these two elements was really made it possible through the collaboration of the court with the University of Louisiana Monroe. So this has been a very positive collaborative experience for them. Another big element of this program, and it's described throughout their program materials and through their program tracks, is the engagement of family members. So these are essential elements here, and as they move through the program, they're going to move into the final aftercare phase, and the family will be asked to do a family action plan. In that action plan, they really are asking each member of the family to consider any of the ones that have been identified, whether it's a family friend or guardian, extended relatives, mother, father, and the youth themselves, to think about their plan for remaining drug-free and remaining in treatment. So the types of things that they are looking at in that family action plan are their continuing engagement in support groups in the community, in any kinds of therapies that they might be involved in, whether they're going to continue to engage with mentors, continued evaluation through drug testing, and involvement in community service. So each of the family members take some responsibility for thinking about the extension of treatment beyond the jurisdiction of the court and continuing beyond, for these kind of disorders, which the other presenters have said are really things that are going to possibly be with them for many years and challenging to them for many years to come. So this really extends the reach of treatment and the reach of the court's jurisdiction. Similar to the previous program, there's lots of opportunity, and of course the phase-type nature of these programs really allows incentives to be delivered for incremental change. So it's important, I think a lot of realization was done that you want to incentivize things as people go along, not create too long of a period before incentives can be delivered, really want to reinforce incremental change for people who are now under the jurisdiction of the court and have lots of their behavior monitored. So if they maintain the rules of the program, then they can have access to gift cards, similarly sports tickets, and perhaps even decrease time spent in a phase. If they have struggling with elements of the program, they could be assigned additional writing assignments and return to court more frequently. So there's a range of graduation requirement, but they include 8 weeks with no positive drug screens, and the evaluation that they've been compliant with the interventions to which they were referred. So this is an ongoing requirement and continued evaluation in order to make it to the point of graduation. So as you can see, and as we've been discussing today, there's a lot of elements involved in these programs, and we, but incrementally, these multidisciplinary teams have come together to consider the changes in the criteria, the expansion of the programs. They've looked at the mission overall of their of their court and what kinds of things are going to give the greatest access to youth in their community. They have evaluated what the resources are and engaged other partners in order to have the continuum of care that they would like to have. They've been involved in reviewing and expanding their screening and assessment measures to really capture not only the substance use issues that the youth present with, but also the associated mental health problems. And they also evaluate around other elements of readiness for treatment and continued motivation and engagement in care, importantly. Essential elements of these programs mentioned throughout the webinar today are evaluation of and adoption of evidence-based practices. Obviously, this is going on throughout the country, looking at models of care that really offer this integrated perspective so that it is important for the family and youth to have that reduced burden to come to some place where they get an integrated, effective treatment offering. So adoption of evidence-based practices in many communities has been an essential component. For some, they have had to really expand access to psychopharmacology that maybe was not part of their program originally, and engage providers that and funding sources to be able to get the resources to offer appropriate medications to the youth in their programs depending on their mental health diagnosis. And finally, they've looked at their outcome measures. As has been mentioned throughout today, there's a lot of incremental change that can be achieved, and there's going to be change over time, and you're starting with this initial phase of care and hopefully possibly engaging in youth in care and making them responsive to think about care beyond the jurisdiction of the court for challenges that they'll have perhaps throughout life. So outcome measures have to be tailored to what the initial program can do and what's realistic in the time that they're being evaluated, but also hopefully to look at the things that the youth will have to consider and their families beyond the purview of the court. So I'll stop at that point and I guess give it back to Joe.
Holly, thank you very much, and thanks to all three of the presenters for doing an excellent job of providing some very complex information in a way that I think is very understandable. Before we close, we just want to do a couple of things. I want to start by asking Tom to give the results of the third question.
Absolutely. Thanks, Joe. So the last question was, to what extent do you think the presence of youth with co-occurring disorders presents a challenge for juvenile drug treatment courts? And as you can see, overwhelmingly the response is that youth with COD do present a challenge to courts. And I think that's a telling recognition on your part. Thank you again for participating in these polls and certainly your interest in this webinar. Joe?
Thank you, Tom. And just as a reminder, recording of this webinar as well as all of the PowerPoint slides will be available at our website, which is NCMHJJ.com, and those will be up on our website next week. Secondly, I want to also remind you that we will have follow-up Ask the Expert sessions, and I'll give you more information about that in a second. But before I do want to thank those of you who have already submitted questions through the chat line around things such as appropriate screening instruments and how best to get the public and private service systems to work together. And so we'll start with some of those questions that are already submitted, but we ask you to please feel free to join us for the Ask the Expert sessions. We'll send out an e-blast to everybody who's been on the webinar, and once again, I'll show you this schedule in this next slide. And so the first one's coming up actually in just a few weeks, and each one will run approximately an hour to an hour and a half and be a wide open question-answer discussion, and looking not only to our three experts today but other people in the field to provide advice and guidance for everyone trying to do a better job for youth with co-occurring disorders. So I want to thank all of you once again for joining us. The contacts for our speakers today, or for Tom here at the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, are there. Thank you once again, and I hope you feel free to join us as we do the Ask the Expert sessions. Thank you all very much, and have a good weekend.